residential, that is, it's not to recoup a cost, it's to encourage development, because I guess the conversion of land from residential vacant to just plain residential is easy enough. I mean, build a house and it happens. So in terms of that reasoning, other local governments have adopted that same approach, because I can't really conceive of any other basis they could apply, because obviously trying to encourage people to do a certain thing makes sense, but are there any other bases upon which they seek to impose such rates?
Yes, there are. I think the town was very clear in its objects and reasons, and I think if we look at some of the objects and reasons from some other local governments, it's less clear. In some cases, there are attempts made to discuss vacant land also having higher costs and higher service costs associated with maintaining vacant land. In other cases, there are quite open statements about encouraging development. In some cases, the phrase sort of discouraging land banking is used. So there are other local governments that are reasonably clear as well, but there is a mixture of reasons. And I think the statement of objects and reasons proposed by the town is very clear in what its objects and reasons are for each of the differential rates. But I can provide a summary. I prepared a summary last year. I'd have to just do a bit of checking to make sure it's still current, but it certainly will give councillors a flavour of what other local governments talked about with their differential rates.
And the reasons necessary? Do you actually need to give a justification or not?
Yes, we're required to publish a statement of objects and reasons. So we need to state what the objective is, and which perhaps in the case of industrial commercial is to raise more revenue, and the reasons we're doing that. The objective is to impose the objective is to impose a higher rate on whether it be vacant land or residential or commercial industrial. And in the case of vacant land, the reason is to encourage development. In the case of commercial industrial, the reason is to recover costs.
And I suppose there's one final question, given that this is going to go out for public comment. In terms of those reasons that are provided, is there any statutory body that's assessing those, or is this simply a reactive process where if somebody complains, then it is resolved through whatever the appropriate forum is?
So the requirement is that the local government consider the submissions. So the local government, so council must consider the submissions when it's considering the imposition of differential rates. So a report will be presented back to council. Obviously, there's only the June meeting left, but the proposal would be to prepare a separate report to council to be heard at the June council meeting earlier in the agenda than the budget. And that report will include the submissions that we receive in response to the advertising of the differential rates.
Yes, so that's the community responses to their views on them. So once we've finished that process and say the decision is to decide to adopt the differential rates, is that decision then assessed by anybody?
No, it's not. There are some parameters in the Local Government Act and that need to be satisfied. And if you go outside of those parameters, then ministerial approval is required. So, for example, you can't have more than 50% of the properties in any differential rating category on the minimum payment, for example. That's one example of a statutory requirement that would need ministerial approval if we were to depart from that. But the differential rates that are proposed to be adopted for advertising by council next week comply with all of the statutory and regulatory requirements, such that further approval beyond council adoption isn't required.
Okay, no, great. Thanks for explaining that process so everyone understands how that works. That was great.
Councillor McWilliam, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I hope you can hear me all right.
Yes.
With regard to the comprehensive communication and information plan, to assist the community in their understanding of the process and the importance of rates as a source of income for the town necessary to maintain service levels, will this include public information sessions over and above the information that's available on the town website and through the town's Thrive publication, and presumably some sort of mail out, perhaps? The reason I ask this is because a lot of people are not IT literate and may find it very difficult to feel as if they are being consulted or heard. And I just wonder if this is being considered as an additional strategy.
Okay. It's not a requirement. It hasn't been. I suppose there's two phases to the communication. The first phase is if council adopts the differential rates for advertising next Tuesday night, then we will place an advertisement in the local paper, and we will put the objects and reasons on the town's website. And we can also do some social media, but we weren't planning on doing anything in addition to that. If a differential rating category affects, I think it's less than 30 properties, then there is a requirement to write to each of those property owners. But that's not the case with the differential rates that we're proposing as far as this report is concerned. So we weren't proposing to sort of do any direct communication, but advertising through those other mechanisms. As far as that's in relation to the differential rates and the specific decision that's going to come before council in relation to differential rates. As far as rating is concerned more generally, we certainly are having discussions administratively about the material that will go out with rates notices. So they are obviously a hard copy document at this point. We are hopefully looking at introducing electronic rates very soon, but that's another topic. And there is a lot of material that goes out, and we're looking at obviously a budget edition of the Thrive magazine that will accompany those, as well as there's other statutory information. And we would also put information on our website about rates, how they're calculated. Sometimes there might be some useful videos that are sometimes put out by Walga or some other local governments that we can share, those sorts of things to, I guess, inform people about rates in general and how they're calculated and determined, because sometimes there's a little bit of misunderstanding there as to what the local government's role is versus the role of the state in setting the valuations. But we weren't, as far as I'm aware, proposing to sort of have any public information sessions where we would be sort of, in face-to-face with the community talking about rates. That hasn't been part of the planned approach.
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of responding from a perspective of various people in the senior category, including myself, but I'm not asking the question, have expressed that they have felt that they're not as included as they might be because they don't have computers, they rarely have smartphones, and so they miss a lot of what goes on the website, and they're not able to follow social media. It's it's not second nature to them. So I guess it doesn't have to be a public meeting as such. It could be perhaps a presentation on a video that happens at the library or something like that. Just it doesn't have to be super high profile, but if we give that opportunity for people to come along and actually understand what's being proposed and how it affects them or doesn't affect them, I just think it's more inclusive, and wondered if it might be considered. I recognise, of course, that there's a cost to all of this, and appreciate that, but would like to see if there's any option for this to be included.
I guess the only comment I'd make there, Councillor, is that I think this isn't necessarily an issue of oh, my dog going on. This isn't necessarily an issue of people in that cohort not receiving information, because it's direct. It's a direct mail out to their mailbox with the rates notice, and obviously, you know, there's a phone number on there for them to call. We have a lot of seniors who do call the rates officers and speak to staff. There's a deferment program and a rebate program in place for seniors as well. So there's information distributed about all those sorts of things that goes in the pack. So I would be proposing to rely on that. I think there might be obviously other forms of other things that we communicate about as a town that might be more suited, because they might not involve that direct mail out to homeowners that the rates notices does do. So I'd be happy to look at it, but it's not something that we would. It's not something that I would propose.
Okay, so thank you for responding. Thank you.
Okay. So, Mr. White, I've got a question, if you don't mind. So, I note the benchmarking on page 10 of the report provides comparisons for the 2021-22 financial year, and at last week's workshop comparisons were provided for other councils that have already listed what their 22-23 differential rating will be. Now, subsequent to that, there have been some of that benchmarking was for councils that were a lot further away from us. Now, subsequent to that, in the last week, there have been some councils joining us that have actually provided information on their 22-23 differential rating, and I was wondering if it would be possible for administration to provide that information through to councillors in the next document. And if you like, I can actually send you some links as well from last year's, because you and I both last year went through a whole host of, so I can send some of that information through that I still have in a folder. If that could happen, I'd be really grateful, because particularly City of Swan, I note that they're, if you could do that, that would be great. That's my question. The other question I have as well is if you could confirm in my mind, CPI, I know that there was a figure provided for annual, but looking it up today, I think Perth's most recent quarter is 5.1 to March.
I think so. Yeah, that's right. And 7.6 for the year. Yes, so it's certainly increasing in Perth. I'd have to check the quarter, but I do remember something around that nature.
Okay. So could we get a bit of information on that, a bit of an update on that as well, towards the end of the week as well? That would be really grateful for that. Councillors, so that...
Sorry, the first question, I guess the reason why we didn't put that comparative data in the council report is because it was circulated. It's sort of at this point in time, it's circulated sort of administratively in confidence. So
okay,
it wasn't sort of something that we could make public. But if there is, so what I propose is perhaps to seek an update of that and maybe provide it via the CEO bulletin for councillors.
That would be fine. That would be fine. I'd be happy with that, because I am aware that, you know, there's a lot of movement around local councils at the moment, and what you may have had last week might not have caught up with this week. So thank you for that. Councillors, are there any other councillors who would like to ask a question on this item? No? Okay, so with that, we'll move on to item 8.2, which is the draft local heritage survey, draft local planning policy, heritage and character, and establishment of heritage areas. I think this might be you, Mr. Gibson. Would you like to speak to this item?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This report is the culmination of a significant amount of work on matters related to the town's heritage, a matter that is particularly important to the community, as evidenced by the adopted SCP and results from previous community surveys and the like. The report is asking Council to consider 3 discrete but related matters. The first is the local heritage survey. The second is the establishment of 3 different heritage areas, and the third is a draft local planning policy relating to character and heritage. Council has previously considered these matters at its August and November 2021 meetings, where it resolved to advertise the various proposals for public comment. In response, the town advertised the proposals concurrently for clarity and for the benefit of community members to consider them all at the same time. In response, received 16 submissions, 12 from community members and 4 from state government agencies. The breakdown of the 12 submissions is contained on page 18 of the agenda. As you can see, the town received 4 objections to the local heritage survey, 3 of which were based on a desire to be excluded from the document, with the specific properties identified on page 19. In terms of Ms O'Donoghue's comments about the Devon Road precinct and the establishment of formal heritage area, it should be noted that the precinct was identified for special statutory controls based on both the 2017 Municipal Heritage Inventory, which was adopted by Council, and the subsequent 2018 Built Form and Character Study, which has also been used to inform the review of the local planning framework. Further, in November 2020, Council resolved to initiate a new local planning scheme that provided, amongst other things, a special control area over the Devon Road precinct. And as such, the concept of heritage areas is well established over at least the last 5 years. Ultimately, it's recommended that Council adopts the local heritage survey and the local planning policy and formally designates the 3 identified areas as heritage areas.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Okay, we have Councillor McLennan who would like to ask a question.
So for all the work that's gone into preparing these documents, I just had a query around the local planning policy. There's been a few comments that property owners don't have clarity around what the implications of that might be for them. I'm wondering if there's an intention to develop like an information sheet or something along those lines to accompany the policy so that the requirements are more easily I guess, understood by people whose properties might be affected?
Through you, Madam Mayor. Yeah, we can certainly look at developing some a document or even just updating the website. Obviously, like any control regarding any query regarding a statutory control, the public's always welcome to contact staff to get a sort of detailed explanation of the things or documents or frameworks that might impact their property. But certainly in terms of the broader request, if there's particular elements of the policy that some might find a bit confusing, we can seek to clarify those through an information sheet or an update to the website.
Right, and just in relation to the Devon Road precinct, my understanding is that every property owner who would be affected in that area received a direct mail out, and obviously we had Julie speaking to us earlier, but we didn't receive any objections from any other property owners in that precinct. Is that correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, certainly true to say that we referred it to all property owners within the affected areas. I'd have to check the schedule of submissions to see if we've got any other submissions from Devon Road, but it appears not.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
And I suppose in terms of Ms O'Donoghue's comment about there was no interest in the policy, there was at least some interest evidenced by the submissions received, but I suppose if you sort of gauge that against other local planning policies that we have consulted upon, we haven't typically received a significant influx of comments or submissions. So This is not particularly unusual or atypical for the town. We actually extended, from memory, the consultation period reasonably generously, just to make sure that we gave everyone a significant opportunity to actually comment. I think it was over 90 days in the end, which is well beyond the statutory minimum. So we certainly, the lack of comments we got was in no way due to the lack of advertising. It probably, you could contend that it speaks to a level of comfort or ambivalence. But in any event, we only got the submissions we got. But it would have been open to anyone else to lodge their submissions with the town for consideration by council.
Great, thank you.
Did I see your hand go up before, Councillor McWilliam?
Yes, but my question was on the same line, so I thought.
Okay. I have a couple of questions, Mr. Gibson, if you don't mind. You will note that I wrote an email earlier in the month about incentives for property owners who are on the heritage list, and I'm wondering if staff, I understand that there are clearly different incentives offered by different councils, and not all councils offer incentives, but I'm wondering if the staff have considered looking at a range of incentives to motivate people to lodge their properties, the ones who aren't even on the heritage list yet, to potentially lodge their properties on the heritage list. So that would be one advantage of the incentives, and potentially another advantage would be to encourage people to restore and maximise the value of these heritage properties and care for them. Has there been any consideration by the staff in respect to incentives?
Through you, Madam Mayor, not in addition to the queries that were provided by yourself and I believe Councillor Polifka. There already are some minor incentives in the community funding policy. As I said in my response to the queries at the time, the regs already provide an avenue for the town and council to flexibly apply the development standards where it's in the best interest of the heritage place. If council wanted to ramp up its incentive regime for heritage properties, it is certainly able to do so. If that involved the provision of financial incentives, that is something that council would have to certainly budget for. But in terms of the proposition that we should be incentivising landowners to nominate their properties to be included on the list where it otherwise wouldn't be on the list, or include it at a level that it does not justify, that is not considered.
No, that wasn't my intent.
That wouldn't be considered.
That was not my intent, Mr. Gibson. Sorry, I just meant if there were heritage properties that haven't yet made it onto the list. But
if there's heritage properties not on the list, there is a process for them to be assessed and determined as to whether they should be included on the list, incentives aside.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Clearly, yeah. Okay, Councillor Polifka has a question, then I'll come back to my last question. Councillor Polifka.
Yeah, two questions. Just following on from your query as to how these properties find themselves on the heritage survey. So just in terms of the process, is it one whereby people have to nominate, or do we send the planners out walking street by street and identifying properties that would be appropriate for inclusion?
Through you, Madam Mayor, we have the existing 2017 Municipal Heritage Inventory, which was effectively the starting point, given that was the document in existence. But we also, as part of the consultation process, called for nominations. And that, I think, process resulted in a nomination for Point Reserve. I think I previously suggested it was Success Hill Reserve. I think Point Reserve was added as a result of a public submission. But basically, it's a combination of starting with the existing document as the status quo and asking for nominations. And as you say, staff who have an understanding of any changes to buildings and development within the town would be aware of what buildings have been removed and in some cases what buildings have been effectively refurbished and upgraded. So it's a combination of those things that have led to the creation of the draft LHS.
And this now relates to the categories. So say a property is entered into the heritage survey and it's of a category which doesn't allow for the property to be altered. In terms of those alterations, say you have a resident owns a heritage.
Excuse me, sorry, Councillor, if I can just correct you on that. The Municipal Heritage Inventory or the Local Heritage Survey is simply a collection of places of heritage value. Right. The statutory restrictions exist by virtue of the heritage list, typically. Right. Which is a separate document under the regs.
Okay. But where there are those restrictions on what somebody can do with their property, so say you have a resident has a property which is on the heritage register, towards the more severe end of things. Say that property owner were embellishing the property, painting it in gaudy colours, but just doing things which were not damaging the underlying fabric of the heritage property. Is that something that could be accommodated, or do we focus on what damage is being done, which is irreversible and doesn't preserve the property, or are we trying to maintain the properties in the form that they would have been? So, for example, painted in heritage colours and left to the level of detail that would have been typical for the era in which they were constructed.
Through you, Madam Mayor, broadly the latter, but obviously it's case by case. Councillors may recall its previous consideration of a property on, I think, River Street, north of Guildford Road, where there were some restrictions placed on the property owner as to what they were indeed required to do under conservation notice. So in that instance, from memory, there were restrictions on materials and potentially painting, but effectively the policy is there to ensure the preservation of the heritage value of the place. Now, like every other policy, it is a starting point. It is not a scheme provision. It can be varied. It can be applications can be assessed on their merits, guided by the policy. But broadly, the policy seeks to conserve and preserve places of heritage value, particularly those, as you say, at the higher end of the heritage list scale. So categories 1 or 2 typically are subject to greater controls, and what might be acceptable potentially for a category 3 or 4 in the local heritage survey may not be acceptable on categories 1 or 2 because they exhibit those more significant cultural value, heritage values.
So in terms of the preservation, would it be fair to say we're more concerned with people removing parts from these buildings as opposed to adding additional parts that in future can be removed by a future owner and who has the intent of bringing the property back to its, I suppose, true heritage form?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that is indeed a question for Council what it is concerned with, and it would need to set its policy provisions to address those concerns. So the policy that staff have put to Council deals broadly with heritage controls and seeks to reduce, indeed stop any development that would materially affect the heritage significance of the place. That's not to say that if an application came in for something that might impact it temporarily or impact it in a way that could be reversed, it's not to say it couldn't be entertained. But as a general principle, the policy is based on the fact that the town and the district values its built form heritage and seeks to put additional controls in place to preserve and conserve and celebrate that heritage. But ultimately, the policy settings are a matter for Council.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that explanation.
Councillor Ames.
Hey, there we go. Thank you, Madam Mayor, and through you to Mr. Gibson. I've got a couple of questions, very brief ones. One, we're more so talking about the facade and exterior of all of our managed homes in this particular draft policy. Is that correct, Mr. Gibson?
Yes, it is, except for the managed.
Through you, Madam Mayor. Yeah, broadly, the local planning policy, as I said to the previous question, seeks to conserve the heritage values of the place, which are often the external facade and the appearance from the street or sort of the public realm, but it is not necessarily limited to just the external facade. But the local heritage survey, a fairly thick document that goes into a fair bit of detail, should identify the heritage value of each particular place.
Absolutely. And is there a time frame that we as a local government authority have to have such a heritage plan to be, I suppose, implemented?
Through you, Madam Mayor, in terms of heritage plan, are you referring to the local heritage survey?
Sorry, yes, and
Yep.
and the policy that is obviously attached to it, correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, in terms of the policy, there is no requirement to have a policy at all. This is something that council has sought staff undertake and embedded the task into the CVP, but there's no obligation at all on council to have a policy related to character and heritage. Although if council does choose to establish heritage areas, there is an obligation under the regulations to have an accompanying policy, but also there is no obligation to have heritage areas. So the policy and the heritage areas are both at the discretion of council. In terms of the local heritage survey review, from memory, it's every 8 years, but ideally also aligned to a review of the local planning framework, which we're currently doing.
Undertaking. No worries. Thank you, Mr. Gibson. The questions I have to have. Thank you.
Thank you. I did notice during that Julie put her hand up. Julie, I'm sorry, but this is the formal part of the meeting. So if you do have further questions, you will have to direct them to the staff tomorrow during business hours. So sorry about that, but this is now the phase where councillors will ask questions. Now, I do have an additional question, Mr. Gibson. It might seem minor. Page 20 of the report, halfway down, it indicates that number 57 and number 60 Eileen Street in the proposed Kenny Street heritage area, it was included, but however, these properties are outside the area identified on the map. As such, the references to these two properties should be removed. I was just, sorry if I seem a bit confused, but I just wanted to know, are these properties heritage properties or they're not? I just wanted to understand what was the issue with these two particular properties.
Through Madam Mayor, under the regulations, if council is going to establish a heritage area or multiple heritage areas, it needs to have a policy, and that's, I suppose, as per the comment I made to Councillor Ames before, that policy is required to have, amongst other things, a list of the heritage listed properties within each heritage area. In this case, those properties were identified in error. They're not actually in the areas and they're not heritage properties. So it was just a administrative error that can be easily fixed.
Okay, thank you for that. It just was a little confusing. Councillor Wilding.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just anticipating what I think Ms. O'Donoghue's question would have been, just regarding the Devon Road precinct being Category 2, but the houses on there being Category 3, and just how those two things interplay with each other.
Through you, Madam Mayor, apologies, I did mean to respond to that in my intro, but thank you for raising. She's quite correct in that both the existing 2017 MHI and the draft 2022 LHS identify the Devon Road precinct as of Category 2 significance, and the individual properties, or a good number of individual properties on that street, as Category 3. The reason behind that is that in isolation, the properties, the actual dwellings on the sites in isolation only warrant a Category 3 listing, but it's the cumulative impact of all of those properties in a fairly tight area that probably it speaks to the significance of the heritage area. That's something that's broadly provided for in the heritage guidelines released by the DPLH, the Heritage Council in 2019. It goes on to say that a place can be a landscape, group or precinct over multiple lots, whether or not of individual cultural heritage significance and whether contiguous or located apart. So what that's saying is that just because each individual property might have no or diminished heritage value, it doesn't mean that the collection of places can't have an enhanced heritage value. So that's the explanation there. And that important to note that is not proposed to change. That is something that is embedded in Council's adopted 2017 MHR.
Thank you, Councillor Ames. Oh, sorry, Councillor Wilding. You still have another question?
Oh, no, I was just thanking the officer for their response.
Okay. Councillor Ames, you did have your hand up, but I think you have now put it down. Is that correct? Yes?
That's correct, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Okay. So back to Councillor Polifka.
Following on from the comments from Director Gibson in relation to the fact that you can have houses that are Category 3 and the, I suppose, synergy amongst them elevates that area to a Category 2. My question goes to how, whether it's appropriate that where it is, that entire area is Category 2, and you only have the individual houses protected to the level of Category 3. Does there come a point in time that if a certain number of houses that are Category 3 succumb to persuasive development arguments, that there would in future be a need to elevate the remaining properties to Category 2 so as to ensure that that place isn't destroyed in its entirety?
Through you, Madam Mayor, broadly no, and I suppose the assumption there is probably needs clarifying. If Council resolves to designate the Devon, any precinct for that matter, as a heritage area, the area has statutory controls that wouldn't otherwise exist. That is both the areas, the sites that are on the local heritage survey and or the heritage list and or any other properties that are on neither. So the establishment of the heritage area actually applies as a blanket control to the whole precinct, and almost does it makes the, I suppose, the designations under the local heritage survey somewhat redundant.
Okay, no, that clarifies my misconception there. So thank you for that.
Thank you, councillors. So unless we have some more questions, and I can't see any hands going up, we will move on to item 8.3, proposed outbuilding 137 Walter Road East, Bassendean. And this would be you again, Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This report, as you can see, is for Council to consider an outbuilding at 137 Walter Road East. Similar to the proposals we've had on recent agendas, this proposal was assessed against the R codes, and in this case there were two elements that require a design principle assessment, specifically the floor area and the wall height. Given the location of the outbuilding, it will have no material impact on the streetscape, and therefore Council really needs to consider whether the proposal will have a detrimental impact on the neighbouring properties. In that regard, the town did advertise the matter to the abutting properties and received two objections based broadly on the size of the outbuilding, which is proposed as 96 square metres. Based on the assessment contained on page 27, the proposal is considered acceptable and is recommended that it be approved. It is open, however, for Council to refuse the application, but if it did so, it would need to provide reasons relative to the design principle.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Councillors, any questions? Okay, I have, okay, Councillor McLennan, you can go first. I have several as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. Mr. Gibson, I had a question about the size of the outbuilding. So in our local planning policy, it has the provision for collective 60 square metres, and obviously this exceeds that quite significantly. But I note your comments about the open space provisions and so on. I'm just wondering, so the 60 square metres that is in the policy, what's the staff's rationale for that size limit?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's just taken verbatim from the ARCODES.
Okay. And would a second outbuilding be allowed on this site if this one was approved?
Through you, Madam Mayor, they're certainly allowed to apply, but obviously it would require, in a similar fashion, it would trigger the need for a design principle assessment, because if this is approved, they're already over the 60 square metres. Anything in addition to that takes them further over, so it would need another design principle assessment and potentially another decision of council.
Okay. And my only other question was around their proposal for it to be a dark coloured outbuilding. So just acknowledging that we've currently got the other sustainable development policy out where we've sought to include provision for a lower solar absorbance. Obviously, it's not included in our current LPP 12, but would there be the opportunity for us to potentially revisit that policy and make similar amendments to it to avoid dark structures being, I guess, acceptable with our current policy?
It would be open to council to amend this policy suite. However, it wouldn't capture all outbuildings, and it would be very much open to challenge. Any outbuilding that meets the deemed to comply standards is exempt, irrespective of the colour. And I suppose the issue of the application of the solar absorbance standards is something that will be discussed, I'm sure, as part of item 8.5. But certainly staff could look into it as part of a policy review, but in considering the current application, there is no policy standard around the colour. So council's really, their consideration is limited to the area and the height and the associated design principle.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. That was my question as well, that the variation between the ARCOs, the 60 square metre extending out to a 96 square metre size, with one of the respondents indicating that belonged more in an industrial area than a suburban residential area. My question also comes from one of the objections, I think it was 1.3, from a neighbouring property, indicating previous disruption to their amenity via the use of machinery like grinders and smells from spray painting. So how can the town ensure that this outbuilding will not be used for home business operations that will diminish the amenity of these neighbouring properties?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's proposed that information be conveyed via an advice note, which is really the extent of the town's role in that matter. If there are complaints regarding noise issues, they would be appropriately followed up and actioned as required. But I suppose the matter before council at the moment is the consideration of the structure, which the applicant has advised is to be used for domestic purposes.
Okay. Humour me, if you will, Mr. Gibson. When does domestic purposes, when are those purposes exceeded with commercial activity? Those lines seem to be very blurred in respect to a lot of properties these days.
Well, typically it's a matter of scale and degree and is case by case, but I suppose typically if someone was undertaking activities for a commercial gain, that is a financial gain, they could be reasonably contended to be commercial, but that is not what's proposed in this instance, and in any event it's outside council's consideration on the matter.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, one more question. I know one of the proposed conditions of approval, point 3, requires all stormwater being contained on the site. Just under these particular circumstances, what is the acceptable disposal method for said on-site stormwater?
Through you, Madam Mayor, typically in these residential settings and a shed of this size, they would be normal domestic soak wells.
Okay. Councillor Polifka.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I know we've had a few of these sorts of oversized sheds of late. I suppose my query is, what's the difference between, and putting aside if somebody's using a shed in a manner which is inconsistent with the underlying residential zoning, but what's the argument against not permitting 100 square metre sheds where we currently permit 100 square metre auxiliary dwellings? How do we justify that difference?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I suppose the difference is broadly established by the residential design codes, but it would be certainly open to council to be more flexible in its application of those codes and to allow larger outbuildings. I suppose you would imagine the thinking behind the R codes from the department's point of view is that ancillary dwellings and the like typically appear or can appear to look like a dwelling, whereas an outbuilding typically looks somewhat more industrial. That's not a hard and fast rule, that's probably just a rule of thumb, but broadly, like I say, the R code set out what the deemed to comply standard is that you would meet to avoid the need for a development approval. It is absolutely open to any applicant to lodge any application and have it considered under the design principle. So if the site-specific and context-specific assessment determines that a larger outbuilding is acceptable in the circumstance, it is open to the decision maker to determine accordingly.
In terms of a standing policy for that, I mean, are we able to, if we were minded to do so, delegate that something that was less than 100 square metres would be approved and not come before council?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, and other places do have sort of those policy provisions, not necessarily that number, but that sort of that idea that certain outbuildings or certain sort of incidental structures can be dealt with administratively as opposed to requiring a decision of council. I suppose that would need to be tempered against the desire for abutting landowners to have their objections heard by elected members as opposed to dealt with by staff. So it could certainly be done, but I think you'd need to strike the right balance between efficiency and having council involve itself in at least some of the decision making. Yeah, and look, I mean, certainly without foreshadowing what such a policy might look like, I mean, we would be able to potentially restrict that to, say, lots that were your quarter acre and up. Through Madam Mayor, you could certainly put parameters around it. It wouldn't need a policy necessarily. It would probably more so require a modification to the delegation manual.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So, councillors, are there any other questions on this item before we move on? Okay, so we'll move on to 8.4, community consultation, draft point reserve landscape concept plan. And I believe this might be, oh, there you are. Sorry, you just popped up on my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, would you like to speak to this item, Nicole?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So we've developed a draft landscape concept plan for Point Reserve, which includes both the town of Bassendean managed area and the open space that's managed by Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. So the plan aims to balance the natural values of the site and protecting and enhancing those, and also providing recreational opportunities for the community. So in developing the concept, the site's limitations, strengths and opportunities were assessed. In particular, the location of the lower area, which is within the Swan River floodway and flood fringe. Input was received through a range of sources, including a school workshop with Bassendean Primary School. So the Year 6s, their River Rangers group, attended an on-site workshop and contributed ideas that were used to generate the concept. We also consulted with relevant state government agencies, and they are supportive of what's been proposed. And we held a workshop with councillors who were invited to provide comment on an initial draft. So some final updates were made to create the final draft, and we're now proposing to go out for community consultation. The purpose of the consultation is to find out from the broader community and also the neighbouring residents their views on what's proposed on each element, also to find out how they're currently using the reserve and any additional comments that they might have, and provide feedback on a proposal to rehome the geese that visit the reserve. So there'll be broad consultation as well as mail outs to adjacent residents, a stall at the Bassendean markets, and the opportunity to give feedback both online and with a paper survey and in person as well. So following the close of the consultation, we'll compile the results, assess them and update the concept, which will then be brought back to council for final approval.
Thank you. Councillors, do we have questions on this one? Councillor McLennan.
Thanks. Thanks for the concept plan, Ms Davey. There were just a couple of, or a few features in there that I was quite surprised to see. And I'm just wondering, so for example, I had some concerns about the location of the playground relative to the toilets, you know, having to cross a road. I had some concerns about the soft fall being used on the yoga site. I was also interested to know a bit more about the bike path that was proposed, given that there'd been some discussion about what was originally going to be a pump track, or was not going to be, was proposed to be a pump track, and what's there now. And in conversation with some of the other councils, I know there's other features as well that people have some queries or concerns about. I'm just wondering how, like in the council meeting, without us having had a workshop on this plan before now, how you would propose some of those concerns might be dealt with?
Through you, Madam Mayor, if the councillors have questions, they're welcome to contact me directly. Possibly I can provide information through the bulletin or in an update before the meeting next week. There was some information that did go out about some of what the changes that were made. Yeah. Yeah, but if there's additional questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Okay, I'll let someone else ask questions for now. Thank you.
I have questions as well, but Councillor Carter, your hand has been up for a while.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Nicole. I have a query really about the officer's recommendation, and it reads that the council approves the draft Point Reserve landscape concept plan for the purpose of undertaking community consultation. Is that necessary for us to approve the landscape plan? Wouldn't it just be necessary for us to agree that it be sent for community consultation and then decision made afterwards? Is this not, forgive me, is this not preempting that wording?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I believe this is the process that has been undertaken previously for concept plans. I don't believe there's a requirement for council to approve it. It's just a way of making sure that council are happy with the proposal to seek public comment.
Thank you, Ms Davey. The issue for me is, of course, there are things in this plan, and I'm sure once it goes out to community consultation, there'll be things that we haven't even considered will come to the fore. I have a reluctance to approve it when, you know, that does assume that we are happy with everything in the plan. That's my only reluctance. There are things that I'm happy to bring to you too, but at the moment it's a work in progress. Thank you.
Councillor Polifka has his hand up next, and then followed by Councillor McWilliam.
Yeah, my question's more one of process. So suppose you have some amendments that you wish to make to the map, as I do. How would we be able to make those changes and sensibly deal with that at the council meeting? So say, for example, you wanted to move a car park or to remove a portion of the trail. And look, other councillors might have their alterations as well that might be of a similar nature. As a matter of process, how would we do that and have a discussion about that where we could resolve to send something out for advertising at the next council meeting?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I believe you could make an amended resolution that would note those changes. So approving the draft subject to the list of amendments.
Yeah, I was just in terms of that, I was thinking that it would be quite difficult to, I suppose, put into words. I mean, I do say, picture's worth 1,000 words. So rather than drafting something, I mean, would we have that capability to have a revised plan ahead of the next ordinary council meeting, if that's something which council was minded to do?
I would have to check with the consultants who drew the plan. It may be too short notice to have it available by next Tuesday, and it would depend on when the comments were received by.
Yeah. As I said, just as a matter of process, I just wanted to understand what was possible. So thank you.
Councillor McWilliam.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So my question is really about the paper, the discussion paper says that this is the consultation that's happened so far, and certainly we all recall being down at the Point Reserve that evening, and it was very thorough, and we're very positive about that. I feel as if the plan has taken off on a slightly different tangent from what council was really getting excited about, which was about the environment and the ability for people to come down to the Point Reserve and enjoy the environment and the animals and the bird life, etc. Not so much about bike tracks, which is clearly something that has come in through the other parts of the consultation that you've done. My concern is that if we debate this in a council meeting, it's really going to, it would probably be quite lengthy, and it would also be seen that perhaps councillors were the ones who were speaking out against things that other people had suggested. So I'm kind of really wanting more discussion before it goes before a council meeting. And I'd like to know how that would be possible, because I don't think it's just going to be a matter of us writing in or contacting you, Nicole, one by one. I think we really need, as a council, to be presenting some sort of united perspective on this before it goes out to the public. Can we see our way forward to doing that? Maybe I should be asking the CEO, Ms. Mabs, do you have something to say?
I can see Ms. Mabs' hand up. So, Ms. Mabs, would you like to have some comment there?
Thanks, Madam Mayor. There's probably a couple of options here from a process perspective. I note Councillor Carter's comment about approving a plan that perhaps councillors may not be 100% comfortable with. There's obviously the option of changing approves to notes the plan for consultation, if council were willing to put it out for broader consultation at this stage. But I get a sense that a few councillors would like to make some further contributions. So one option might be, and I'm conscious that Nicole has been working with a consultant on this, and there may not be the time between now and later this week when we push out the agenda, it might be that we postpone this matter to the following month's council meeting as another option, allowing time for further feedback or a workshop if necessary.
I'd really appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Councillor McWilliam, Ms. Mabs. Okay, I had multiple questions on this one, but given the manner in which this conversation has proceeded, I think I will leave my questions and have a discussion with the CEO about this tomorrow. My preference, I think, would be to ensure that councillors are all happy with what goes out for advertising. So, and I'm hearing from the CEO that that is something that can be accommodated. Is that right, Ms. Mabs?
That is correct.
Okay. So, Councillor McWilliam, your hand is back up. So you'd like to ask something else?
No, it's just me trying to take my hand down and repeatedly it coming back up again. So please ignore it for the moment. I'll keep trying to take it down.
That's perfectly fine, Councillor McWilliam. Okay, thank you, everyone. So we'll move on to 8.5, draft local planning policy, sustainable development, and Ms. Davies. Oh no, is it Ms. Davies? No, Mr. Gibson. Apologies.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This report is for Council to consider its policy settings in relation to sustainable development, specifically in relation to two existing local planning policies, number 2 and 3. Staff have reviewed these policies as well as similar policies from other local governments and subsequently prepared a new consolidated draft LPP for Council's consideration. In March of this year, Council considered the draft policy and resolved to adopt it for the purposes of advertising, subject to various changes, including the breadth of application of the policy, as well as changing the restrictions in relation to roof colour. During the advertising period, 11 submissions were received, most broadly in support of the policy. The main issue for Council's consideration in adopting the policy position on sustainable development is seemingly the breadth of the application of the policy. The original draft prepared by town staff was limited to split residential density coded areas within the district, so as to broadly align with the existing LPPs 2 and 3. In March, Council demonstrated the preference to apply the policy to all low density residential development. However, staff maintain its recommendation against that proposition for the reasons identified in the report. It is open to Council, obviously, to, however, proceed with the broader application of the policy if it so chooses. One thing to note is a very slight error in attachment 8.5.2, proposed clause 6.1.2 Roman numeral 2, which is in relation to the solar absorbance. That should refer to 0.5 rather than 0.6 in response to a change that Council made prior to advertising. On that matter, staff don't have any particular in-principle objection and will reinstate the 0.5 during the week.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Councillor McLennan has her hand up and I'm sure there'll be others. So, Councillor McLennan.
What a surprise, I've got my hand up. Mr. Gibson, thank you. My first question was around the 0.6 solar absorbency, so thank you for clarifying that. My question is, can you please help me this week to write an alternative to revert it back to a broader policy, please?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, I can.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I do have one comment, Mr. Gibson, regarding there were 11 submissions where the majority were in favour, and there was a comment in the report that these submissions were from existing residents, and of course this policy will affect more likely future residents. And I must admit to wondering how you were going to canvass opinions from future residents. It did seem to be a little bit out of the scope of what this council can achieve.
Through you, Madam Mayor, yeah, the purpose of the comment certainly wasn't to infer that we should be consulting with potential speculative future residents, but more so give a bit of context to the submissions that we received, noting that it would be reasonable for council to have regard to the financial impact on any of its policy settings. And I suppose that's a matter that was dealt with in some detail as part of the draft amended public art policy. So it was certainly, it was just simply to identify that whilst there was support from a small number of residents in the context of 16,000 people, it was reasonably limited, and the council should be aware that any policy setting that adds cost to development in the town needs to be carefully considered.
Okay, Councillor Polifka, you have a question, sir.
Yes, yeah, I understand the two alternatives, and there's the breadth of this that's in issue. But regardless of any of that, my concern is more to heritage properties. So when we're talking about retained dwellings and what has to happen in relation to those, and we've heard what's intended under the heritage item that we've discussed this evening. If people are to construct houses in a heritage manner, are they able to get concessions, given that I suppose some heritage architecture, if that's what's intended on Devon Road, probably doesn't lend itself to that? Look, I'm not suggesting someone's going to install a thatched roof, but just in terms of architectural styles, older styles are probably not as energy efficient as those which we're seeing now. How do we resolve those two policies?
Through Madam Mayor, there's probably a couple of things there. In the draft policy, in terms of roof structures particularly, it does make specific reference to heritage considerations. So if you've got, say, a heritage precinct or an area that was defined largely by sort of zinc roofs, we would seek to accept a bit of flexibility in terms of the materials, even if it went against one of the other policies. And I suppose that's a concept that is embedded into the regulations. As I said, as part of the previous item, is that the regulations provide flexibility to the decision maker to vary the relevant standards where it's for the benefit of a heritage place. So where, if the town received an application in a heritage area, if council indeed makes the heritage areas, and sought to apply two policies, but one may be running at odds with the other, obviously we'd need to consider the matter in its proper context, but there would be a presumption, you'd suggest, that under the regulations, the heritage matters should be considered more heavily than the environmental matters. And that's a matter that's basically embedded into the draft policy in terms of the roof colour.
And could that be extended to all matters? So can we place a priority on heritage over environmental aspects, given that heritage properties are of limited number, so it's not going to have that large an impact on what we're ultimately trying to achieve?
For you, Madam Mayor, I think it's implicit because the planning regulations, as I say, contain a specific provision about varying development standards for the benefit of heritage places. It doesn't contain equivalent standards for environmental purposes. So I think it's fairly clear in the regulations that where there was a contradiction of terms in terms of a policy setting, that the heritage settings should apply.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So, Councillor Carter.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I'm looking at the policy. I don't see any statement about the use or non-use of artificial turf, which has a great deal of implications on sustainability, particularly in a warming area and a heat sink. So is that deliberately left off, or is it something that we can consider? Thank you.
Through you, Madam Mayor, it was deliberately left off because typically the laying of turf or artificial turf wouldn't constitute development and therefore wouldn't be something sort of within our purview as a matter of considering applications for development approval. We do, however, have a landscape information sheet. I don't know necessarily that it provides any guidance on artificial turf, but staff can certainly revisit that information sheet and possibly provide some information on that.
Thank you very much.
So just following on from that, Mr. Gibson, my understanding is that artificial lawn has for a very long time been banned in the town. So when you provide that information, I'd be very curious and interested to know where that is situated in our policies.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I can probably answer that now. I'd suggest it was probably prohibited in our verge treatment policy. Mr. Adams or Ms. Davey might want to jump in if they know off the top of their head, but I'd suggest under the permissible verge treatments that prohibits the use of artificial turf.
I always thought it was not permitted in developments, new developments as well. Councillor Carter has her hand up, so I'll revert back to Councillor Carter.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. Yes, I was on the JDAP at the when I was on council last, and it came as a policy of that new developments should not be using artificial turf. That the policy was to allow drainage, to allow, you know, the positive aspects of natural environment. So I think that a lot of it came through from, you know, a wider than just Bassendean, that was accepted in the JDAPs at the time, as far as I'm aware. Thank you.
Through you, Madam Mayor, one way it is probably controlled in practice is if a condition of development approval calls for a landscaping plan to the town's satisfaction. The town, obviously using its own information sheet, would have a presumption against artificial turf and could police it and regulate it that way. But if someone was to lay artificial turf outside the scope of a development approval, there would be relatively little the town could do.
Mr. Gibson, can we have discussion on that later on in the week? Because I'm really interested in following up on that particular aspect. So if you don't mind, I really would like to have a discussion about that. Councillors, are there any other questions on this particular item? Okay. So we'll move on to 8.6 asset management policy. So I believe this is Mr. Adams. Welcome, Mr. Adams.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and good evening, councillors. I'll just try and provide a brief overview of the asset management policy. I am mindful that the policy has come to council previously, and I just wanted to try and outline the differences between this policy and those that have come forward before. As an overview, the difference between this policy and previous ones is that this one is more prescriptive than previous versions, and this is evident by the specific definitions which are within the policies, such as our ratios and what renewal means and the like, but also defining the framework, life cycle management, financial sustainability, along with the roles and responsibilities of council and the administration. But similar to other versions, it does follow the integrated asset management framework and the infrastructure management manual, which are all standard practices within the industry. The policy provides an overarching guiding document and provides the direction for our asset management strategy, our asset management plans, and the ultimate delivery of services to our community. The asset management policy, strategy and plans are integrated with our strategic community plans and corporate business plans and the informing strategies. And through this process, we ensure that we are in alignment with our strategies, but also that the assets are performing to the level of service that's required by the community. And I think it's important to note that, you know, as the Town of Bassendean and the Town of Bassendean Council and the Town of Bassendean Administration, that we ensure that we have sound knowledge of our assets and that we're aware of the long-term community consequences of maintaining public assets, and that we ensure that we provide for adequate resources, adequate knowledge, adequate data, but also adequate long-term financial investment from the town. And although there's no actual associated risks or financial burden with the adoption of this policy, it is important that we are aware of that and that we do make adequate allowance within our long-term planning, both from a resources and financial perspective. In regards to our role, it's the administration's role to provide the corporate governance and oversight and provide adequate information, data and advice to council, so to enable the council decision-making process. CMC's responsibility to provide oversight of this policy, strategy and plans, and then finally, I suppose it's council's role in the decision-making role to ensure that we do have adequate resources and adequate investment from a short-term and long-term perspective to provide assets for our existing community and the future community as well. So hopefully that provides an appropriate rundown of what we're trying to achieve with the new asset management policy.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Do we have any questions from councillors on this one? We have Councillor Polifka.
Great. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So in relation to assets that are on our asset register, I see all these ratios that aimed at maintaining those assets. Is it the case that under this policy that all existing town assets would be maintained until there's a direction from council that an asset is to enter, for want of a better word, a decommissioning phase?
We do have an asset disposal policy that will be coming forward as well. There are the occasional minor assets that we dispose of, and obviously if we're going to dispose of significant assets, then that will come to council at that time. I can't really think of any offhand that we would dispose of, but there may be some into the future, say if we're going to upgrade a building or sell some real estate or something like that. So,
but this policy though would cause the administration to continue to maintain all existing assets until there was a conscious decision for it to be decommissioned. So it wouldn't be the case that an argument could be raised that an asset be decommissioned because it had fallen into disrepair, because under this policy, assets wouldn't fall into disrepair unless they were deliberately being decommissioned.
Look, essentially that's correct. I was referring to some minor plant that we decommissioned from time to time, and they've come to the end of their life. But you are correct, yeah.
Yeah, and then that question was aimed more in the context of land, buildings, the larger things. So that would apply for them, and probably more so than to the more minor assets that aren't going to be of great consequence.
Yeah, that's correct, Councillor. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pliska. Councillor McLennan, I think, was first, and I think Councillor Carter, did your hand go up as well? Yes. Anyway, Councillor McLennan first.
Mr. Adams, we've had some discussions about when assets come to the end of their life and not automatically replacing them either with like for like, even if we do want to continue to have an asset of some form. Is that going to be captured more in the strategy than the policy? Like, where will that be, recorded as the direction that we want to take?
Yeah, I think it's probably going to fit more into the plan, actually, Councillor. The plan starts to go into all that detail, and I suppose you might be referring to an item such as a playground or something.
Yeah, something.
Yeah, and I think that really sits at the plan level. So the playgrounds are identified in the plans, and their age is identified there as well. And yeah, we wouldn't be going and replacing playgrounds that aren't considered fit for purpose in their, in this current day and age. Yeah.
I guess even things that may not be quite as significant as a playground. So, for example, this is the first thing that comes into my mind. Say, for example, some of the seating on the BIC reserve that we've had conversations about in the past, that when that was installed, potentially there may have been options that were more suitable for that location. So more minor assets like that, the idea that if something, as they come to the end of their life, that there's a conscious process where there's consideration given to, first of all, whether or not they actually do need to be replaced, and if they are going to be replaced with something that may be more would be superior to what's currently there, or alternatively we might want something that's not quite as substantial.
Yes, and that's what we do, Councillor. There's many there's many minor assets that we could replace like for like. Quite a lot of signs. There is the occasional seating and those things, and we're simply not. There's, we really look at where the value is for the community, so we don't address those just on a like for like basis. And the seating that we are replacing at the moment is done with a higher grade, higher level seating. That's more, I suppose, in tune with the surrounding environment, rather than we have a lot of seats that are galvanised steel, which don't look great and may not be appropriate during summer and both winter. So there are a lot that we're replacing with more appropriate materials. Yeah.
Okay, and location is considered as well sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my question was, that's great that that's what you're doing, but where is that actually going to be captured as part of what our plan is? So you leave the town tomorrow, and then the next person that comes in, how do they know, what it is that's been discussed and that that's the plan moving forward?
Yeah, we do need to improve our plans that support our processes that support the plans. Yeah, that's true, and that's something that we've got to work on in the near future, and that's part of my plan. We have spoken about taking a more placemaking approach, which we have started that process within our asset management plans, but haven't really got to full implementation of that as yet. But yeah, that's an important component to bring into our long-term planning, and it currently isn't fully captured. Yeah.
All right, but thank you, because now I understand where that will be included. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So following on from those questions, Mr. Adams, I seek to understand, like, we have this policy and if this policy is approved, my question is that the depth and breadth of the information is more in the strategy and the other documents. So my interest is, how do future councils access that information? How is that engagement going to be progressed in the future, so that new councils who may be sitting in these seats in the future have access to the information over and above what's in the policy?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Mayor. Look, I think what transpires is, similar to, doing an upgrade at Point Reserve, or it might be Palmerston or Padbury. Those things come to council. I don't think it's really appropriate for that to sit within an asset management policy. The asset management policy is to cover, the broad range of assets, which includes the transport portfolio, the property portfolio, the recreation portfolio, and the fleet portfolio. And the asset management policy has always been an overarching document to set the direction for council and the administration, and I think that's important. We then have the strategy, which is the how we're going to do it, and then we're really starting to look down deep into the plans, where there's a lot of information, and I think that asset management isn't everyone's cup of tea, and we will need to provide that continual information flow between the council and the administration, and generally if there are significant works that take place, then they come to the budget, and there can be an intention in the budget of where that money is going to go, and I think to date that's well communicated between the administration and council, and is covered off on, and I don't think that is appropriate that sits at a policy level when we're considering asset management and the $250 million worth of assets that the town has. I think we really need to keep things at an appropriate level.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Ms. Mabs.
Sorry about that. I just couldn't click on that microphone. Apologies. Just to augment Mr. Adams' response, in respect to council's role with the asset management framework, obviously the policy is being provided for consideration by council next week. Underpinning that is the strategy and the plans, which were provided via the bulletin, and collectively they make up the asset management framework, which is a really important component of the integrated planning and reporting framework, which would form the basis of any induction to future councils. It's really important, I think, that councillors understand how those key planning artefacts sort of work together in terms of the SCP, corporate business plan, and the asset management side of things as well. So we would continue to provide that as a minimum every 2 years. And just as we did for our new council, where Phil provided the plans and the strategy not that long ago, we would do so in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mabs. Councillors, do we have any other questions on this one? No? Okay, so we'll move on to 8.7, review of council policy, sports lighting. Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll keep this reasonably brief. The purpose of this policy is for council to consider revoking the existing sports lighting policy for the reasons set out in the report. It's simply a part of the town's rolling review of council's suite of policies, and its removal will not impede decision making on matters relating to sports lighting.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Very brief. Councillors, anyone with questions on this one? No? Okay. So 8.8 is the adoption of the quarterly report period ending 31st of March 2022. Ms. Mabs, would this one be yours?
That is correct. Thanks, Madam Mayor. The quarterly report reflects Q3 of the 21-22 financial year and aligns to Council's corporate business plan for those priorities and actions that fall to this financial year. Also attached, forming part of the quarterly report, is a copy of Council resolutions recommended for deletion due to their completion. Councillors may have noted that outstanding council resolutions were provided to councillors via the bulletin last Friday, just in terms of a progress report. Council is being asked next week to receive the quarterly report and also delete the outstanding council resolutions marked for deletion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mabs. Okay, councillors, do we have questions on this one? Councillor Plifka.
Yeah, just on the deletion of resolutions, if a council resolution has been enacted as the project or whatever it is has been completed, do we need to? We wouldn't be revoking those resolutions because I mean they've been carried through. Is it resolutions that haven't been completed and are no longer relevant because we've taken a different direction that would be removed? I'm just trying to understand the circumstances.
Thanks, Councillor Plifka. If you, obviously we've provided a list of those resolutions where progress has occurred, and through action we've concluded what council have asked us to do. Alternatively, if council does change tact and the resolution is no longer relevant, we may, through a report to council, ask for that resolution to be revoked. So that's, was there a specific matter at hand that you'd like to inquire on?
No, not in relation to any specific one, but just the process of if a resolution has been carried through, is it whether it's necessary to remove that resolution? Because I mean that resolution can still, or could potentially still stand to record that that's what council asked to be done and that that's what had been done.
Yes, and we would document that. We're also looking at, I guess we have a system where we can capture all of those previous resolutions which have now been completed and are closed off, and what we actually carry forward are those resolutions that still require work. And I know Councillor Hamilton queried about the search capability, which I'm planning on discussing with you this week in terms of the functionality in the new dock assembler system and how that can be supported.
So we would essentially have two categories being completed and discontinued resolutions. Is that how that would work?
No, we have completed or in progress. So something is completed if it is no longer current. Like, for example, if council changed tact and a resolution is revoked by council because something new or it's superseded by something. Alternatively, officers could have concluded the work on a resolution and therefore it would be recommended for deletion.
Okay, so there's no distinction between resolutions that have been followed through and have been, well, for want of a better word, completed, as opposed to resolutions which are abandoned midway because council has decided to take a different approach. So there wouldn't be a record that would show what had happened.
There would be an audit trail, whether it's
Right.
it would require to revoke a resolution, would require council to reconsider the matter. So there would be an audit trail. So we're only asking council to recommend the deletion of a resolution where work has either been completed or the resolution is no longer valid. And there should be something that we could trace that back to, like a report of council where council have made a decision.
Okay, yeah. So we would understand by deleted that was not deleted from the outset. That as in that resolution never existed. It would be demonstrating that resolution had reached had concluded.
Yes, that's correct. And maybe deleted not a good word to use in this regard, because there is always going to be a record of it. It's the resolution has now closed because it's reached the end of its life, either through being revoked or work being completed.
Look, I like that word. Closed is good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Councillors, are there any other questions on this item? Okay, so we'll move on to Children's Services Daily Fee for Wind in the Willows Early Education Centres 2022-23. I think this would be Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. That's correct. So the purpose of bringing this to Council is to, I guess, present the proposed fee that we would recommend for 22-23. And the reason for doing so now in advance of adoption of the budget is so that we can provide adequate notice to families, because we would like the increased fee, if it's adopted by council, to commence on the 1st of July. The fee is currently $123 per day, and the recommendation is to increase the fee $4 a day, 127, which equates to a 3%. So that's what's recommended in the officer report.
Thank you, Mr. White. You just faded out there at the end, but
oh, sorry.
I think no, that's okay. I think everyone's got the gist of it.
It's not a complicated one.
So, councillors, are there any questions on this item? No? Okay, so we'll move on. That's the end of the reports. The next item is item 9, which is motions of which previous notice has been given. There are 2 motions that I've put up. They're very straightforward. If you want to ask questions, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine as well. So up to you, councillors. No questions. We'll move then to confidential business. So I would ask Ms. Kania if we can cease the recording and the live streaming before we go behind closed doors.